Hello, and welcome to this podcast on engaging with councillors effectively. This podcast is brought to you by Law for Life, a legal education and information charity. Over the course of the years, we have developed a range of legal education programs and information materials to build knowledge, skills, and confidence to deal with housing issues such as evictions, disrepairs, the homelessness application process, and many more. Check out our website advicenow.org.uk for more information. While knowledge and skills are essential, they are not always enough to address legal problems, as there are some real bottlenecks in the system that make it difficult to ensure access to decent housing. For this reason, in 2020, with funding from Trust for London, we held a series of online strategic forums aimed at increasing knowledge of community and grassroots groups over existing remedies and channels which can be used to address housing problems. This podcast focuses on the role of councillors. Engaging with councillors can be a very effective route for addressing housing-related problems in a quick and affordable way, as it doesn't require the help of a legal professional. Councillors are often one of the first points of contact for people facing housing issues and for their advisors. We are thrilled to introduce Sue Lukes, a Labour councillor for Highbury East, a ward in Islington, who at the time was the Borough Migrant Champion and the Vice Chair of Housing Scrutiny and Audit Committees. She ran independent housing advice services many years ago and is now a freelance consultant working on migration and local services. Sue will talk about the structure and powers of councils and how they can be leveraged to address housing problems. I'll now hand it over to Sue.
I just say it's a pleasure to see some, known faces and organisations here. Barnet Housing Action and also Salisbury World, who are both organisations that I've worked with in the past. I'm sure many of the rest of you in places and so on that I've worked with. You'll be aware that there's a lot of different layers of local authorities in the UK, and you need to be aware where housing sits with them, and to a certain extent, some other things that might concern you, things like social services or some funding authority and things like that, go to other bits, if you like, of local government. So in London, we just have the two layers. We have boroughs, and then we have the Greater London Authority, and of course the London Mayor, who sits within that. Essentially, housing is a borough responsibility, but the Mayor holds huge amounts of funding for housing. So a lot of the sort of bigger grants for housing development and so on, in terms of developing social or affordable housing, that goes via the London Mayor with a bit of control from the London Assembly. So if there is a housing problem in your patch in London, you go to your borough councillors, and I am a borough councillor. The other if you go to an MP, essentially what the MP will do is try and put pressure on the local council. Some MPs have very good relationships with their local council and do that very effectively. Some don't. It depends a bit on how good the MP's office is. I'm very lucky. I'm a councillor in North Islington. My local MP is Jeremy Corbyn. He's always maintained quite an active casework sort of thing going on in his office, and they take everything up and they do it well. I have seen some pretty terrible casework from other MPs' offices. But so in terms of, if there is something going wrong with housing, you're probably better off starting out at least with a councillor, but an MP is an alternative way to go about it. And you'll also be aware, I'm sure you're going to cover it sometime, of the Ombudsman service that you can also use to complain about what local authorities are doing if there is maladministration. But I won't go into that at all, because it's very much a sort of separate area. But councils are a little bit worried if they get a negative ombudsman report. They're not keen on it. They have to respond to it. They have to, investigate what they've done wrong and put it right and so on. So outside London, you may well have district councils, metropolitan authorities, county councils, and borough councils. And county councils, where they exist, will hold the social services responsibility. So sometimes you get people batted backwards and forwards between the housing department and social services and things like that. Not in London, where the two, they're both in the same borough. So I'm a ward councillor. I've only been a councillor for 2.5 years. I I've been involved in party politics in the Labour Party for over 30 years, but I only decided to become a councillor when the leadership of the Labour Party changed, and I thought this is something I want to get involved in. And I should say, you've caught me at a moment when, although I am a backbench councillor now, I am actually about to take up a cabinet post. I'll explain what that means in a moment. So basically, I can still be indiscreet at the moment, but in 2 weeks' time, I'll have to be very careful what I'm saying in meetings like this and so on. So for the moment, what you've got is a backbench councillor here. And what that means is that I don't hold any extra posts within the council of responsibility for, say, social services or housing or health and well-being or community safety, which is the post I'm going to be taking up, or anything like that. So it's kind of it's an interesting position to be in. I came in because I like casework. I used to do it and I really enjoy doing it. But I do know that a lot of councillors find it very hard to do, and that's often a problem. They don't necessarily know what the best thing is to do. And I don't think anybody interacting with a local councillor should be shy about guiding them, if they look like they're not sure what to do next, about the next steps to take and where you want the pressure to be put on and things like that. Why do people become councillors? Well, I look at my fellow councillors in Islington, which is a decisive majority Labour council. Basically, I think a lot of people come in because of political commitment. They're already involved in politics in a range of ways, and they'd like to see the local council do the political things that they are promoting. Some people do it because it's one step on the way to a career. It gives you extra experience. It shows that you can sort of run things and so on. Quite a lot of colleagues have moved on into quite good jobs and things like that. Some people come in out of a sense of community service. They really do want to represent their local community. They're rooted in it. They've been there for years, and they see everybody else making a mess of it and think they could do better. I'm not sure why some others. I mean, I look around my colleagues and think, why on earth did you bother sometimes? But there you go. So what happens when you become a councillor? When you have to go through, certainly in London, it's unlikely you're going to get in as an independent. So you're going to have to go through some process of selection within a political party to be put up for the council. And I mean, that varies as well. So, for example, I mean, some councillors live in the area for which they're selected, some don't. That may be a question of the politics of the local party branch, or it may just be that there's no vacancy where they live and so they've moved elsewhere. Well, I've got a councillor who lives on the estate I live on, who actually represents the neighbouring ward because there are no vacancies in our council for the time. When you finally get elected, I mean, people don't get elected by huge majorities. You do need to realise that. I mean, sometimes it's like sort of, oh, well, you only ever get a Labour or a Tory councillor in this ward. But certainly our majorities are not huge. They're in 3 figures, not 4, and sometimes in 2 or 1. And so you can actually influence people, especially if you have some idea of how much of a majority they've got. And that's very political advice. But it's worth looking up the last elections and seeing that, because frankly speaking, a councillor with a majority of 20 or 30 is going to be a lot more inclined to run around and do things than a councillor with a majority of 500 or 1,000. Because they know that every vote counts, and you may well be, it's not just you, it's your neighbours, it's the people you talk to, it's what people find out about as a result and so on. Once you sign up, you are signed up to quite a rigorous code of conduct. You're not meant to bring yourself or the authority into disrepute. You're not allowed to receive any gifts. And you are expected to share information with officers when you need to share it. I mean, that is about things like safeguarding and potential fraud and things like that. It wouldn't include sharing personal information where there wasn't an issue about that. So it's perfectly okay to say to a councillor, I don't want you to pass on this particular information or whatever. But the councillor would have to come back to you and say if there was a safeguarding issue or if they felt that it might lead the council to act illegally or something like that. I mean, being a backbench councillor is quite liberating in that you can kind of say and do a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do in other roles. But it also does sometimes feel, I think, for some councillors, it feels as though it's very disempowering because a lot of the decision making goes on in other places. I don't know if I've got some notes here about how committees work and things like that, but in most councils in London now, we have what's called a cabinet system. Those of you with long memories, people who've been around a while, may remember that we used to have a committee system. And basically, each bit of the council had a committee that looked after that bit. And the chair of the committee, if you like, was the head person in relation to housing, social services, something like that. Nowadays, what you tend to have is a cabinet system with a leader who will select, usually with the approval of the ruling group, members of the cabinet to be responsible for particular areas. And then outside of that, you get what's called scrutiny. And that will be committees of backbench councillors taking a good look at what the cabinet and the leader are doing. So it's a kind of check and balance system. So the leader may, sort of go off and do something, but the scrutiny committee may then call them in and say, hang on a minute, is this working? Is this how we want to be spending this budget? Is that, what are the problems here? Can we make suggestions for improving and things like that? And I'll tell you what I've been doing on housing scrutiny in a moment. If you misbehave as a councillor, then you get called in by the whip. The whip is just another councillor selected for that job, and their job is to maintain discipline. So one way of misbehaving is voting against the policy of your party group. So, for example, if there's a development going on in the area that is supported by the leader and the cabinet, but you think it's not in the interests of your ward, then you could vote against it. You would then get called in by the whip. And they might then suspend the whip, which would mean you were no longer a member of that leading group, which meant you didn't get in on any of the decision-making while you were suspended. If it got bad, if you did it several times, they might even report you to party HQ. And certainly in the Labour Party's case, you might then be threatened with expulsion from the party. You wouldn't stop being a councillor, but you'd lose all the resources that you've got within the party. And you'd probably find yourself quite isolated because mostly councillors in London are grouped in parties. And it's the parties that make, a lot of the decisions certainly in Islington, it's Labour group that does a lot of the decision making. And that's where the leader is very much held to account. So you can always say to people, if you're in a party, if you're talking to a councillor in the ruling party, one of the ways they can take something up, one of the ways they can do things, change things, is actually raising it in group and getting support from other councillors. And that's been very effective for me in the past. Sorry, I was going to say about casework. Mostly, my casework now mostly comes in via email. It also comes in via the phone. I have my phone number on the council website. Most councillors don't. It's a landline, and I've got it on I screen calls, but it just feels to me like people do some people do find it difficult to use email or to turn up to surgeries, and it's only fair. Surgeries are not happening at the moment because obviously, nobody's going out, leaving the house or going into places or whatever. So everything comes in via email or the phone. And people turn up and present you with their problems. We have a resource in Islington at the town hall who is one person who will help us with casework, who I might go to if somebody comes in. Recently, for some reason, people have started turning up with parking problems. It's not an area I know anything about. So the casework person at the town hall has explained to me who does what in parking, and she's taking those things on and passing them on to the right officers and things like that. But mostly councillors tend to do their own casework in areas that they're concerned about or interested in or know are a big deal in their patch. So I would get an email or a visit or a phone call, and I would take down the details, and just like anybody else doing casework really, then pursue it. All I can do is talk to the relevant officers and say, first of all, what's going on here? Why has this happened? Are you doing this right? And then potentially raise it up 2 or 3 steps, if you like, in the officer hierarchy. So you might have got a decision made by a frontline homelessness officer. This person is not vulnerable, for example, so we're not going to give them much of a service. I might look at that and say, this doesn't look right to me. What will then happen is that the officer will tell me this, will respond to me within 14 days, the normal sort of process, by saying, I made this decision based on this and this and this and this. At that stage, most officers try and produce a lot of legal speak to say why it is that their decision was the right one, it's often wrong. I mean, I can say that because I used to run housing aid centres and I used to supervise housing solicitors, and I still have quite a few friends in that sort of field. So I know that, but a lot of councillors wouldn't. But you can find that out and tell them. If you've got backup, if you've got people behind you or with you who can just go over what's been said, you can pull holes in that officer's letter. The councillor would then normally bounce that up, maybe to that person's supervisor, maybe to a departmental head, and say, no, I think this is a wrong decision. Okay. Now, obviously, there's parallel processes that could also go along with that. You might also be looking at legal action. You might also be looking at a complaint about things that the complaint the officer's done wrong or whatever. You might be looking at an ombudsman's complaint. If legal proceedings have started, generally it's quite difficult to raise something that is part of the content of those legal proceedings. But to give you an example, something I've got still on my desk because I haven't found out what's happened to it yet, was about somebody who was declared not to be vulnerable. And I could see that, I mean, the legal decision was rubbish, but there's a solicitor on the case, a very good solicitor. So she's contesting that in terms of taking it through the procedures for appealing against a homelessness decision and things like that. But what I've been doing parallel to that, is taking up the way the letter was written, which was that it was just, how can I put it? The letter was written in a tone that just really wasn't appropriate for a public servant to somebody who pays their wages, because frankly residents pay wages, you know, through council tax and so on. That's how council officers are paid. And it really wasn't an appropriate tone. It was quite contemptuous, I thought. So I've been taking up, if you like, the tone of the letter and saying, hang on a minute, if somebody saw this letter before it went out, they shouldn't have okayed it. And actually, if this officer is writing letters like that, they shouldn't be allowed to send any letters out without somebody checking it first, because it's the wrong tone. It's not the way we should be talking to residents. So I suppose moving on to sort of other roles, I'm also the migrant champion. We have a lot of champions in Islington. An officer in another council said to me, oh yeah, champions, they're great for keeping backbench councillors occupied and out of the way. But I don't think they're very good at that if champions are any good. Most councils don't have as many as we do, I found out, but all councils will have some, and you can be creative about using them. Champions generally have a role of, you know, take this particular group of people or issue and keep an eye on what the council is doing about it, get to know the officers working in that area, and sort of, you know, try and develop the work so that it's better and so on. And also see, you know, take up particular cases that might illustrate a problem in that area. So I'm a migrant champion. There's only 2 of us in the country. We keep hoping there'll be more. Do please encourage your councils to get one, because they're really useful. And what we do is take up all issues to do with migration. So all of the Windrush cases, the issues about European citizens who, you know, may be finding it difficult to prove their rights and so on at the moment. All of those sort of very much within our remit. So as an example, there was a Windrush case in our borough where she was being pursued for rent arrears. So I was able to take that up and say, hang on a minute, you know, she was denied the right to work or benefits for 4 years. Of course she's in rent arrears. We'll hold off until she gets her compensation, that kind of thing. But I can take up cases across the whole borough as the migrant champion. Generally, the convention is that that you would only take up in your ward the cases otherwise. So I would take people in Highbury East, but as a migrant champion, if there's a migrant with a problem, I can take it up across the borough, and I do. So that's quite a useful role. Every council has to have an armed forces champion. Okay, I'm not going to get into the politics of why somebody thought that was a good idea, but it's actually not a bad thing to think about who your armed forces champion is, because every housing issue will affect people who have served in the armed forces. You know, they are other residents after all. So if you've got an issue about vulnerability, for example, or something like that, if you can think about how it might affect somebody who was a former member of the armed forces. You can go to the armed forces champion and say, this is going to affect people coming out of the armed forces, people with PTSD, people with war injuries, things like that, and you might want to take it up as a champion. As I said, I mean, we have a private rented sector champion, we have a reading champion, we have an old people's champion, a women and girls champion. So, I mean, there's a lot of different options there. You should check and see what champions you've got. And as I've said, if you think that there is an issue that, you know, is not being dealt with well across the council, then you can simply go to your local councillor and say, I think the council should have this sort of champion, you know, whatever that might be. I found it a great role for ranging across a lot of issues and taking them up. I mean, that Windrush issue, just to give you an example, I was taking it up and I was getting stonewalled by the rent people who were saying, well, yes, but at least, you know, can't she pay something? And that sort of thing. And I just went to Labour Group and I said, look, this is Windrush. You know, this is a major scandal. It's an appalling injustice. It's an affront to, you know, sort of to equalities and so on across the piece. And we shouldn't be having any part of it. And we really shouldn't be pursuing rent arrears in this way. And they agreed. And, you know, and so the rent arrears they're not written off. I mean, she still owes the money, but she's not being pursued in the same way. So sometimes, I mean, Labour Group were just going, my God, we could possibly do that. You know, didn't realise that it was happening. And the same again with the Now Medical issue, which I'll come along with. You know, I took it to Labour Group and got support from Labour Group on that, because I was a bit worried that our cabinet member for housing might be a little bit wobbly or be bamboozled by officers on it. Scrutiny committees, which is another area you can use quite well. Different councils will have different structures, right? Some, I think Brent, for example, has one scrutiny committee for like absolutely everything, which doesn't strike me as being a particularly effective thing to do, because it's not, you know, you can never sort of get into much detail or whatever. We have quite a few. We have a health and social care scrutiny committee. We have transport and environment scrutiny. We have housing, and I have now forgotten what other ones we've got. But anyway, I'm on housing because it's my sort of area of interest. And generally, and there's also usually a policy and performance committee, which can also be a scrutiny committee, which is another area that you can take things up. If you think that what the problem you've got is a problem about the way the council is performing its duties, you know, you can't just go to a leader and say, sign this off. Leaders, you know, they need to go back to their group. They're constrained by the law. They can't just, you know, pass policies and things like that. If it's not already written down how they're, you know, meant to be doing the monitoring, then actually we can, you know, you may need to get a policy passed. But one of the ways you might want to think about how you get equalities properly monitored is to talk to the chair of policy and performance and say, where is your ethnic monitoring? Where is your age monitoring? Where is your disability and gender monitoring? How are you going to improve that? Because it is a policy and performance issue. Because the bottom line is your public sector equality duty is a duty, and your local authority has to perform those duties. The scrutiny committee structure, there's a chair, there's a vice chair. Generally, I mean, we do 2 scrutinies a year, one big, one small. And those are decided in May, because the council year starts in May, because we all get elected in May. And then, so the topics, if you like, would normally be decided then. This year, everything's gone weird, so we're actually deciding the scrutiny topics the end of this month, because we've had a suspension of meetings and things like that. But generally, it's worth talking to your chair of the relevant scrutiny committee or the vice chair and saying, what are the topics going to be? What are you thinking about? Is there something here that we'd like you to look at? So typically, housing scrutiny often focuses a lot on the council's role as a landlord, and Islington is a landlord, because we've taken as many things back as possible into council control. We're not a great fan of arm's length type arrangements. So a lot of it is about, are we doing our repairs properly? Are we responding to, you know, how do we do major works, that sort of thing? How are we building more housing? But I've pushed, so I've had one scrutiny on homelessness and one on the private rented sector, which Law for Life very kindly came along and gave some evidence. And we look in a bit of detail at what's going on with the council, and we make suggestions and recommendations, rather than suggestions, for the way in which the council can improve the way it operates in that area. So, to give you an example, on the current scrutiny, the proposals come into thinking about council private rented tenants on council estates, and the fact that our estate staff should be spotting problems in those private rented tenancies and telling people about their rights and putting people in touch with organisations like the London Renters Union and so on, so they can exercise their rights. Coming up with a more coordinated system for keeping information on poor quality landlords in the borough and sharing that with neighbouring boroughs and so on. And realising that private rented sector tenants will turn up in all sorts of different bits of the council. You know, they won't necessarily walk in and say, we have a private rented sector problem. They may be turning up in social services. It may be turning up in schools as a problem that the children can't study because of the damp or something like that. So we need to make sure that all of that information about rights and what we can do to help people is made known to everybody possible. So those are the sorts of recommendations, and they've been well received. I think officers are saying, yeah, we could do some more of that, would be better. So yeah, worth talking about scrutiny topics and getting those. And you can check up, or if you want to know about committees and things like that, it's all on the council website. They're public bodies. You can go to meetings. You'll get excluded from stuff that's about private matters or whatever, or commercially insensitive, but on housing scrutiny, very little is. And basically, you can look and see what they've discussed and how they've discussed it. You can talent spot different councillors and see who's being particularly energetic about taking things up, or people who are interested in the issues that you're concerned about, and go to them and say, I want you to take this up or whatever, because I can see from what you said in housing scrutiny that you're interested in that. They will be thrilled. I don't think anybody bothers to read the minutes. So, you know, it's great. Somebody says here, how can we change their approach to housing because they're hamstrung by austerity? I know, I mean, absolutely. We are absolutely desperate. We're up against the wall in terms of finance, even more terrified now with the pandemic, because the government said go out and do all sorts of things and has not been clear about how much they're going to fund it. So we're facing a fairly terrifying budget this year. But at the same time, there's a huge number of things that are basic statutory responsibilities about providing decent advice and information to people, about treating people as, you know, as proper customers, if you like, and not as people who don't deserve a service. And you know what? Damp housing is not legal. If there is housing that is running with damp, then there isn't a choice about not repairing that. So it just isn't true that councils can't do anything. What we really can't do anything about is probably 50% of my caseload, which is people who come in and say, my housing isn't killing me, but it's inadequate. You know, I am one parent, you know, with a small child and another baby on the way in a single room flat. I'm a disabled man with 2 children, you know, in a 1-bedroom flat. I mean, you know, that we can bump up, you know, the points, we can check and check again. But if the housing isn't there, it's not necessarily going to be possible to do very much more than that. But that's the only thing. You know, if those flats are damp, then they need to be repaired, either through pressure on the private landlord, in which I include housing associations, or by putting, you know, by sorting out the council's responsibility as a landlord. So, I mean, I think, you know, there are sometimes, I think people too quickly say, oh, it's the government's fault, oh, it's your fault for voting Conservatives in, or something like that. You know what? You don't have to stand to be a councillor. And if you don't want to take responsibility for what your local authority is doing, then stand down. Because, I mean, obviously, if you're in opposition, it's slightly different. For me, it's a lot easier to say that. But if you are in the ruling group, then your local authority has that responsibility. The last note I've got here was something about where you can find information out about the council. Okay, do complain about the website. Just do it, you know. I mean, if it's not there, you can't find it. You're all on it. I mean, think about what it would be for somebody who was coming to it new. You're all turning up to a seminar like this. You're probably better informed than 90% of the people in your borough. So if you can't find stuff on your council website, they can't either, and that's not right. The website is there to inform people. I often go to officers and say, come on, you know, you really don't want your department represented by the rubbish I'm finding on screen here. And sometimes you can just make sensible suggestions about the way things are laid out or the content and things like that. You can also find stuff out about, you know, the council from your local councillors, but we all have quite limited sort of partial knowledge until you end up as a cabinet member, when you should know all the people involved in your bid. So, for example, like I said, when I got a load of parking inquiries recently, I haven't got the faintest idea about parking. So I had to go off and find somebody who would tell me who to talk to. But then usually, I mean, I'm 2 years in, I've now got an address book of people I trust in different departments who will be good at responding to questions. And most local councillors will do that because it's easier. And if I don't, then I might phone up a colleague and say, "Oi, I've got a problem on this. You know, do you have it? Do you have anybody I could talk to who's a good person to talk to in that department or whatever?" And of course, we've also got another address book of people it's never worth raising things with because they don't come back with anything, or they try and tell you that it's all the law or something like that. So, I mean, ask councillors and ask them to pass on that information. If all they're doing is passing on your inquiry to an officer, then the next time, you know, it's, if you say to me, well, you know, can I now find some other way of dealing with this? I might well say, you know what, if you talk to this person who's the department head, they will usually sort it out. And that way, you know, I've made my life easier because you'll go direct to them next time anyway. But you can always come back to me as a councillor if it doesn't work or if that person's moved. And of course, good officers do get promoted or get sick of it and go somewhere else. Yeah, the gatekeeping thing, I know, I mean, you just have to keep plugging away at it. I don't think, I'm just looking at the inquiries I got before. The website thing I've mentioned, people promising everything. I mean, I agree. I have seen it happen sometimes. I'm afraid, I mean, I find, you know, I sit in surgeries and, as I said, 50% of the inquiries are from people I can do nothing for them other than say, I'll check your points over and see if we can squeeze a few more. But actually, you need 100 more points, and the most I'm going to get out of this is 20. And that is not going to make a difference. You know, go join a housing campaign and get some decent social housing built in London. I don't say that necessarily if people are in distress, but if they look like they might want to do that, because you know, it's not going to make a difference. And there are lots of other people ahead of you in the queue, and actually that's the way, you know, and actually they are in more housing need than you are. But I will go in, you know, with my fists raised if people have not been given the right points and things like that. People being sent from pillar to post, I mean, I agree. And I've seen officers do it. I've seen people try and duck out of responsibility and so on. I do think that councillors can stop that. I think once there's a bit of a light being shone on it, then officers are less likely to do that. Because I think that we have, you know, it's more likely that people will just sort of realise that their conduct will come under scrutiny. Or that it'll be raised with somebody higher up in the system or whatever.
Pass you on some questions that were pasted in the chat earlier.
Thank you.
So the first one being, how do we get our councillors to take up champions? Okay, I think you should go and talk to them. I mean, the reason we've got a migrant champion was because I said, we need a migrant champion. There's a big crisis for migrants at the moment. You know, there's Windrush, there's the European issue, there's lots of migrants with no recourse to public funds, you know, and we've agreed. I think partly because they thought it might shut me up, which it didn't. But that's sort of, you know, I think if you find a councillor who's really enthusiastic about something, then you could say to them, why don't you propose that you be the private rented sector champion, or why don't you propose that you be the older people's champion or something like that? And then you could take this up across the borough. And the good thing about that is you can keep an eye on policies and things and make suggestions for changes in policy. It's not formalised. I mean, it's not like a committee structure or something like that, but it does give you that authority to pick up cases across the borough, which is really helpful. And it does give you a hotline to officers in a way that you wouldn't otherwise get. So you just go and say, okay, you need, you know, but ideally you want a councillor who's ready to do it before you go, so that you've got somebody ready to go for it. And you can even discuss with them about helping them write the job description or something like that. I mean, I to a certain extent wrote my own.
So that's one.
Yeah, that sounds easy. I'm not sure it's that easy, but
you can find me and I can send you, copies of the job description that I have and that Hosnier in Oxford has, who's the other migrant champion.
thanks. Then there's another question. How can councillors pressure housing associations to do repairs?
First of all, housing association, when I started out as a councillor, I got a whole load of cases from a particular housing association that's active in my patch. And they were all pretty bad. And I was told very firmly that because housing associations, a big one, housing associations are partners with the local authority. You can't just go straight to them. You have to go via somebody who works in their chief exec's department who fields inquiries from MPs and councillors. So I did, and we didn't get very far. Because I was worried about one case, I was really worried about what might happen there. I thought there's a real fire danger. I actually went to environmental health and said, I want you to inspect this property because I'm so worried about it. I'm told that's not what you're meant to do as a councillor, but in fact the environmental health were worried about it enough and they went. Environmental health obviously have the responsibility for inspecting places that are in disrepair within the council patch, and if they are worried enough, they will respond by doing an inspection quite quickly. They then rate the property on the health and safety rating system. So, I would say that, you could ask the councillor to basically get environmental health involved if you think the disrepair is bad enough that it really does represent a threat to health. Environmental health will be quite professional about that and will say what they think needs to be done. Depending on the association, most housing associations have an awful lot of properties. And the larger ones, obviously the sort of big 15 in London or whatever. So, sometimes obviously it's difficult because there's a very specific need for a type of property or whatever, if you need a particular type of access or something like that. I would say your local councillor, you should ask the local councillor to get environmental health in to inspect and make some orders. I have to say that when environmental health then contacted the housing association, in my case, they responded like the same day. They really didn't want orders made against them. And I'm assuming that's because the regulator for housing associations will know about that and will take it as a big, sort of mark against them. So I do think, I think you should treat housing associations as private landlords. And that's what you do with a private landlord. Yeah. I know they have deals with councils and I know they house people off the council waiting list, but they're not going to stop doing that because of one complaint about disrepair. So although councillors will usually be told, oh, you have to go through this rather complex kind of system, if you think that there is a risk to health there, then you should say to the councillor, I would like to call in environmental health. Can I please say that I'm in touch with you about this? Sorry, that's one thing is if you are corresponding with somebody who is a council officer and you are also in touch with a councillor, check with the councillor first, because I might say, no, you know what, I'm not really supporting you on this, because I try not to promise everything. But basically, do say in the letter, or the email rather, and I am copying in Councillor Jones, because I understand that, because she is also very concerned about this, because that just kind of moves it up the inbox a bit, and just sort of gets things moving along a bit more. And it means that they know that the councillor will escalate it if it isn't dealt with properly. So they'll just take a little bit more care about it. Might help a bit.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Gabriella, I'm not sure what the new statutory legal duty in respect of what?
I didn't know they didn't before have the duty. But there are new statutory duties that are going to be, they're coming down to local authorities with regards to housing, to housing people, vulnerable people, and so on and so forth.
Oh, I know. Is this to do with domestic violence?
Yes.
Domestic abuse and so on, and vulnerability. Sorry, it's just that there's an awful lot of statutory duties.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no. Okay, yes. Certainly there's a decent lobby on issues around gender violence and so on.
Yeah.
So I think, there will, I'm sure, have been discussion about it. I mean, I know whenever they sort of propose changes in eligibility, forums that I'm in, that work on issues around migration, we all kind of take a look at it and pull it apart and make suggestions which are never taken up about how they could be improved and things like that. I think on gender violence, you're more likely to get a hearing. But from a councillor perspective, I mean, what you will find is that councillors know a lot less about the law than you do. I'm talking to you as sort of local activists or people representing other people and things like that. Councillors get very little training on the law. I mean, we get like 2 hours on the public sector equality duty, but it's not compulsory, and some councillors don't go to it. We get, you get inducted over a couple of weekend days soon after you get elected, and that covers every single council department, all the processes and procedures, all the IT systems, which take up a huge amount of time because none of them work properly, and a little bit about the sort of council's basic statutory responsibilities. A lot of focus on children, and because the council is a corporate parent and things like that. On housing, very little. I mean, you just get told which bits of the housing department are which and things like that. So if you go in explaining that there are statutory duties here and the council is not fulfilling them, then, you need to be able to back that up, because councillors will not necessarily know that. Most councillors don't work in housing, and, they won't know that, if somebody's health is so badly affected by their damp, then actually, this is a statutory issue of disrepair that the council could end up paying out an awful lot of money in court about, or that the housing association could do that or whatever. Do the residents need to contact themselves? I think it's fine for professionals to contact councillors. I think it's great. I mean, it's sort of, I like to meet residents as well, but especially when they're vulnerable or very busy, why wouldn't you take an inquiry from a professional? As long as you've got the authority, obviously, to raise the case. No reason at all why not. And it does mean, again, I mean, for me as a councillor, you build up an address book. So there's a department at the local hospital that's working with families of children with long-term illnesses. And there's a couple of nurses in that department who are brilliant. And it's been really good, because then I've met other families with children with long-term illnesses and been able to ask the nurse about, which bit of the health service should they be accessing and things like that. So it's nice. I mean, I like having a network.
Any other question?
No, I hope I've picked up on what people raised at the beginning. Oh, there's a brilliant question. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, this is my specialist topic, so do stop me. How much power or funding do councils have to extend accommodation provision for people with no recourse to public funds? Okay. First of all, I mean, bear in mind, I'm unusual amongst local councillors in knowing what recourse to public funds means. Most councillors won't. One of the things I have found very helpful in guiding fellow councillors is to point out that the vast majority of people who are barred from recourse to public funds are from Commonwealth countries, and as a result have a vote. And so it is quite important for councillors to realise that, because I think they think of it as being, a migrant, they're not really a resident in that sense. But of course there are millions of people with no recourse to public funds. They're all residents. They're all entitled to a range of local services. People who are barred from recourse to public funds in almost all cases are people who have limited leave to remain, with that as a condition, or have no leave to remain. And councils do have the power to accommodate them if they have a vulnerable person or a child in their household. But it's social services rather than housing who will be doing that accommodating. Housing may assess the case. They will then have to refer it to social services. As a result of the pandemic, we've got another group of people who were street homeless or in unsuitable accommodation for street homeless people, because you couldn't, because it was shared and it was not COVID safe, as we're learning to call it, who all had to be moved out and were moved into, a range of accommodation that was procured by the Greater London Authority and by other housing authorities and by local boroughs as well. At the moment, the instruction is to keep those people in the accommodation until they can move on safely. And most councils, as far as I know, are still doing that. They have the power to do it. There's always a power to accommodate somebody with no recourse to public funds. But I could sort of talk you through the law on it, but I think it'd take too long and so on. But essentially, you would have to say that you're doing it either to avoid an abuse of human rights, which in a situation of a pandemic, where travel is very difficult and therefore people can't really consider going home, is almost certainly the case for everybody. Or, of course, as a public health measure, because you don't want people wandering around the streets potentially infecting other people. Although, interestingly, the data from the homeless family, people who've been accommodated by local authorities and this get people off the streets, seems to show that there were very, very few cases of COVID-19 amongst the people who were accommodated, which is because, of course, homeless people are very socially isolated, actually. So, essentially, the power is there. The question is whether or not the council, first of all, whether or not the council wants to exercise the power, because there may not be a duty. And the second, and the big problem is who will pay for it. And central government has been really kind of confusing with local authorities, having said, get everybody in, you know, take them all off the streets, make sure that they're not, it's not safe to have them out on the streets. It then started getting very coy about how much they were going to pay. And so the issue for most local authorities isn't really the question of legal duties, it's who's going to pay for it. And at the moment, we're still extending the funding. You know, the central government has said, oh, we'll extend the funding a little bit longer, you know. But I think, as with most of the pandemic-related stuff, now that we've seen an increase in cases everywhere, it's going to get less and less possible for central government to say, oh, well, the moment has passed, we don't need to pay you anymore. If the whip has the power to make councillors toe the party line, what happens if different ward councillors see a particular project development as negative or positive for their residents? What if there is a split? It's interesting. Yes, okay. Generally, it'll depend on how important it all is. I mean, I think Haringey Council is the example of all of this, isn't it? Because, I mean, in Haringey, effectively what happened was the Labour Party split over a massive development that the council wanted to go in as a joint venture with a load of private developers on. And as a result of that split, a load of councillors who were in favour of the development got deselected, and a load of councillors who were against the development got selected. And then they fought the election and won, and basically, you know, there is no longer the joint development going on. So, but in the meantime, there's a lot of threatening of, you know, we will take this to a vote and so on. I mean, for a lot of things, you don't need a vote in group. That's the problem. You can have a vote in council for some things, but quite a lot of these developments, they're planning decisions and executive decisions. They don't come to full council. If you are desperately unhappy about something that is going through full council, you're advised to go and talk to the whip. If the whip thinks that your vote will not make a difference because they've got a solid majority on it, they'll probably suggest that you just give your apologies for that meeting and don't turn up. Because they don't want the kind of, you know, people voting against or with the opposition or anything like that going on. If you vote against something that has been decided as the group line, then you will get disciplined. What happens will depend on what happens in your group. You know, if it's a group that is quite, I don't know, unfriendly, you'll probably get suspended from the whip for, you know, a month or two or something like that. I know a colleague in Enfield got suspended for 3 months, I think, for voting against the budget last year. If it's a friendly group, then they may well say, okay, we get it. This is something that is very important to your residents. And I mean, especially if it's a marginal ward, they might think, what the hell, you know, let them vote against. We won't discipline you. Then it looks like you're defending the residents, but we'll get it anyway because we'll vote it through. That's politics. I mean, it's sort of, I think if your vote made a big difference, then it is likely that you would get disciplined significantly for going against group policy. On the other hand, if you are reasonably good at organising, and bear in mind, quite a lot of councillors who've come in the recent past have got a bit of a community organising background and so on, you could stir up enough trouble in Labour group to make the whip want to back off. And it would be a question of whether you had the time and the energy and it was an important enough issue to do that.
So if you're contacting as a professional, which councillor do you contact? A cabinet member or your own office-based ward councillor?
I would normally go to the ward councillor first, unless the issue is not so much an individual one as a policy one. But even then, I might start with the ward councillor, because the executive member, the cabinet member, just may not have the time or the interest in tackling that. I mean, I think quite a lot of cabinet members, executive members, they call the same thing. They do get a bit captured by officers sometimes. Councillors don't necessarily come from a background of knowing huge amounts about the area they're in. I mean, our current cabinet member for housing is a solicitor, so, he knows what he's doing. But a lot of cabinet members for housing don't. So they get a bit bamboozled by officers who say, oh, no, you couldn't possibly do that. And of course, everybody does it, that sort of thing. And so sometimes having an energetic ward councillor or a champion who will go out and find things out and challenge and so on is a better way of doing it than going to change policy, than necessarily going to the executive member. And executive members really don't have a huge amount of investment in rocking the boat. If you can tell them, look, what you're doing is illegal and you're just going to get taken to the cleaners in the courts, and by the way, 4 solicitors have already been instructed and they're good, then they'll listen to that. When I've sort of said to, when I've said to the Director of Housing and copied my exec member in, oh, and by the way, Bindmans or Hodge Jones and Allen or whatever have been instructed, then, you tend to get a response within the same day.
So sorry, just to clarify, so is that the ward councillor for where your office is based? And it just
no.
Deal with a lot of people who have no fixed abode.
Good question. I suppose it's wherever they were sleeping last, I would start with. But to a certain extent, with no fixed abode, you've got a bit of a choice, haven't you? You might want to check out the records of the various councillors where they, if they've been sleeping in different places, and say, do you want to, try this councillor because they look like they've been doing more on homelessness or whatever.
And also, sorry, there was a follow-up question. At what point should you go to an MP instead?
I'm not sure. MPs will have the ear of the leader, and leaders meet MPs, quite regularly and chat. And if the MP was made aware, because it won't be the MP who looks at the letters, it'll be the sort of people working in their office, that there was a big issue there, they might say, look, you need to worry about this. But if it's an individual case, the MP is just like another kind of advocate, really, in all of that. Because if you're approaching ward councillors about something that is the council's responsibility, then basically, they are the ones who are going to be in the machinery and able to get things done. And MPs may well just send a copy of whatever they're doing over to them anyway. I get copied in by Jeremy Corbyn's office quite a lot if it's in my ward. I don't know. I think MPs' inquiries are probably not as effective as councillors getting stuck in.
And can I say also, like, MPs are not always from the same party, like
exactly, which
makes it more difficult as well.
They might be more sympathetic or less sympathetic as a result. Yes, absolutely. But also, sometimes it's good to have extra forces on your side as well. Really, I think sometimes people just don't do things because they don't think they can, or they don't know enough they don't feel secure enough about the information and things like that. And all you people working in, as activists or in organisations or whatever can actually, make your local councillors, sort of understand that they have a lot more power than they realise. And it's a shame if they don't, because that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to represent some of your power locally.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the evening.
Thank you all.